Great. So let us now turn to our guest who's been very patient. We have Andrew Kirkwood, who's joining us now from Myanmar, from Yangon. Thank you so much for your patience. And without further ado, Mr. Kirkwood, I will give you the floor. You can go ahead. Can we actually see him on the screen here?
You see me and hear me?
I can hear you. We don't see you yet on the big screen. I think, yes, here you go. So please go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Stephanie. And good evening to everybody from Yangon. Thanks for having me there, as it were. I'd like to start by saying that tomorrow will mark the 8 months since the military seized control of the democratically elected government here. And we use the term crisis a lot in this world, but I really want to emphasize now that the people of Myanmar are really living in a severe crisis at the moment, no matter how one defines that term. Before the military takeover, the United Nations was supporting 1 million people affected by the conflict here inside the country. And that number, the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance now is 3 million. That's a tripling over the last 8 months. And in addition to that, there are now 20 million people living below the poverty line, nearly half the population. And that's a rate of poverty that we haven't seen in Myanmar for at least 20 years. Now, most of those people that I mentioned below the poverty line are not yet part of our humanitarian caseload, but they could become part of that. And we're working hard to make sure that they don't. But I think, I guess let me just say that the crisis that we are seeing today is really the result of a compound effects of conflict, which is increasing, COVID-19, which especially the sort of devastating third wave in the summer, and of course the military takeover in February. So effectively what we have here is a crisis on top of a crisis with yet another crisis on top of that. The 3 million people that are now in need of humanitarian assistance are in many of the border areas of the country, in Cayenne, in Kachin, in northern Shan, Kaya, but also in the urban and peri-urban parts of Yangon and Mandalay, in the center of the country, which has essentially very rarely seen any conflict in the past. Over 200,000 people have been newly displaced since the 1st of February due to the conflict between the Myanmar armed forces, many of the ethnic armed organizations, and these newly formed People's Defense Forces. Essentially, I mean, the situation, again, to stress, is quite desperate. And here on the ground, humanitarians are working around the clock to provide people with humanitarian assistance. And I think that's the second point that I really want to emphasize here, is that the United Nations and its humanitarian partners continue to stay and deliver for the people of Myanmar. As we speak, well, not quite as we speak, we're in the middle of a nighttime curfew period here, but I mean, our colleagues are on the ground. They're delivering food and cash assistance. They're improving access to healthcare, water and sanitation, and other basic services. Since February, our food and cash assistance has reached more than 1.4 million people in rural communities all around the country, as well in some urban and peri-urban centers in the country as well. More than 660,000 people have received various protection-related services, including child protection, gender-based violence services, and psychosocial support, all in conflict-affected areas. Around 260,000 people in conflict zones have received temporary shelter support, and 330,000 people have benefited from improved water facility, access to water, sanitation, and hygiene services. So, I guess really what I'm saying is that we are saving lives. We are making a difference in people's well-being, but we're also quite frustrated that these numbers aren't higher and that we aren't able to reach all of the 3 million people who we know need urgent humanitarian assistance. So, a few words on the reasons and I guess the challenges, if you will. First, there are really significant operational challenges. Travel, COVID-19 restrictions, roadblocks, and overall insecurity are definitely main reasons we can't reach everybody we want to. And I think it's really incumbent upon me to take this opportunity to call on all parties to use their influence to facilitate the safe and unhindered access for humanitarian workers and also our humanitarian supplies. But second, we're also not able to further scale up our response due to limited funding. I mean, despite the multiple crises that I described, our response really remains underfunded. We have requested a total of $385 million to reach those 3 million people this year. To date, we've received about a third of that. And that means that we have a funding gap of roughly $250 million just for this year. And that means, in turn, that we really won't be able to reach everybody who needs our assistance. So, yeah, again, I appeal to all partners to consider what support they can provide to help us continue to provide services through the end of the year. The United Nations Emergency Relief Coordinator has confirmed a new SURF allocation of $10 million for Myanmar, and of course that will help. But much more is still needed to prevent suffering. Thirdly, and I guess lastly, I think we really need the parties to the conflict here to sort of depoliticize, if I can say it that way, our humanitarian and COVID-19 response efforts, which remain guided by the principles of humanity, impartiality, independence, and neutrality. Essentially, we need access, which is safe and unimpeded, so we can reach those 3 million people in need. Thank you.
Let us now turn to questions. I think, Edie, you have a question?
Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you very much for doing this briefing. I have a couple of follow-ups. First, there have been reports of increasing conflict, not only in the minority areas along the border, but also these the People's Defense Forces. Have humanitarian workers been seeing that on the ground? Have they been thwarted in their efforts to get to people in those areas? And I wonder if you could describe for us, we all know that there were 1 million people in need before the military takeover. Who are these 2 million new people who are now in need of humanitarian aid? Thank you.
Stephanie, would you like me to come in right away?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, yes, as we are seeing increased conflict. I think the 1 million people that we were supporting before were in areas mainly around in border areas, and the conflict is it's the longest. Some people call it the longest running civil war in the world. So the conflict in those areas was has been going on for quite a long time, and the United Nations and its partners have found ways to work in those areas quite effectively despite the conflict. Now, the conflict there is increasing, But I think more acute is the problem of the new areas of displacement, which is a combination, is conflict due to these People's Defense Forces, sometimes working together with ethnic armed organizations. And what the challenge for us in those areas is that this is new conflict. Sometimes it happens in areas that we can't predict in the same way. We don't have the same network of local partners to work with. And in these areas, we are finding it even more challenging than in our sort of one would call traditional areas of conflict and humanitarian assistance. And that continues to increase since the 1st of February, those dynamics.
And well, a follow-up on that. Where are these new areas? Are they in the border? Are they in different parts of the country? And then I wonder if you could answer the second part of my question on who the 2 million people are.
Right. So a large part of those extra 2 million people are in these new areas of conflict. And if you asked me the question, if you asked me that question 2 weeks ago, it would be different. My answer today, the areas, the hotspots right now are, one of them is in Chin State in the west, which is one of the ethnic minority areas. We've seen tens of thousands of people displaced over the last couple of days. Entire villages have been displaced. People living in the forest with very, very little. But in other, there are places in the center of the country, in the so-called Bamar heartland, which have seen very, very little conflict over the last 20 years. And there's a large part of those 2 million people, additional 2 million people, are in those areas.
Yes, from the room, please go ahead.
Hi, Caitlin Hoover, CNN. Could you just clarify, what is the working relationship with the military junta right now? Are they part of the obstacle to some of the delivery of humanitarian aid? And also, could you clarify a bit what you meant by needing the parties to the conflict to depoliticize your efforts? What are some examples of how that's been politicized?
Yeah, I mean, let me take the second part of that first. When I say depoliticizing, I mean, what I'm really talking about is that, emotions are running very, very high here. Many people are frustrated, and some people, frankly, confuse the delivery of humanitarian assistance with taking sides in the conflict. The United Nations and its partners are deeply committed to delivering humanitarian assistance according to those principles that I mentioned, which are well accepted around the world. We're here to support the people of Myanmar, certainly not to take sides in the conflict. That's really what I'm talking about. The first part of your question around the military authorities, I mean, the military authorities in Myanmar control the vast majority of the country. Of course, we have to liaise with them in order to move around the country to deliver our humanitarian assistance, and we continue to do that. We will continue to do that. Humanitarian access in Myanmar has always been a challenge, and I think it's fair to say that it has become more challenging since February. But at the same time, it's we have succeeded in gaining access to more than 1 million people over that time. So it's difficult to characterize it completely one way or the other. Definitely access constraints are there, but we are able to negotiate access successfully in some places and sometimes.
Let me now turn to the screen. Margaret Bashir from Voice of America. Maggie, you have the floor.
Hi, Mr. Kirkwood. Thanks. Sorry, my audio was cutting in and out, so I apologize if I ask you something you may have already addressed. But on the 3 million that you say you need to reach, I didn't quite understand. Is it 2 million? You said something also about 2 million. So I didn't know if, how many are you reaching of the 3 million, first of all? And then what are your biggest asks right now? What do you need from the Security Council, from the Secretariat, from the military, from whomever? What do you need to make, to facilitate the access and the deliveries that you need to do? And I'm just wondering how long you've been in Myanmar and if you've seen the situation get progressively better or worse since February. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I mean, just the numbers very quickly first. Before February, we had a humanitarian caseload of 1 million people. We now have a humanitarian caseload of 3 million people in need, and so the 2 million refers to the difference between the two. It's, you know, in terms of the number of that 3 million that we are able to reach, as I said, you know, since February, we provided, for instance, cash and food and cash assistance to 1.4 million people. We've provided other assistance to other people. So, you know, the number is clearly not 3 million people. And it's not as high as we would like it to be. What do we need? I mean, we need different things from different people. So, you know, in most parts of the country, as I said, it's the military authorities with whom we have to negotiate our access. There has been for many years and continues to be quite a complex and cumbersome procedures for getting permission to travel and send our supplies. Of course, a significant simplification of those procedures would, I think, help us a lot. But at the same time, as I said, the overall response here is so underfunded that you know, we would definitely need more resources in order to reach those 3 million people. There is no way we can reach those 3 million people with the resources that we have at the moment. In terms of, you know, me personally, I've been in Myanmar for more than a decade, and I've seen the country go through many difficult times, including a large cyclone here in 2008 that killed 150,000 people. I've never seen the situation as bad as it is now, and you know, the difficulty is that we think it's likely to get worse. Those 20 million people who are now living below the poverty line, you know, rates that we haven't seen in at least 20 years. You know, those people could very quickly drop further into a level of destitution where they will require life-saving humanitarian assistance. So, you know, it is a very, very concerning situation, definitely the worst situation, I think, in the country that I've seen in the time that I've been here.
Let me take just one more question from the screen before we come back to the room. So Rick Gladstone from the New York Times. Go ahead.
Well, thanks, Stephanie. Thank you, Mr. Kirkwood, for the briefing. We just spent the first part of this briefing talking about Ethiopia's plan to expel 7 humanitarian UN workers, officials. Have you been getting similar pressure from the Myanmar junta authorities over what you do in Myanmar? And can you comment about the kind of signal that Ethiopia has just sent to the UN on humanitarian access in conflict zones? Thank you.
When I was also listening to the brief on Ethiopia, and when I said that I've been here for over a decade, I was actually here when the resident coordinator for the United Nations was asked to leave the country in 2007. Now, we're not facing that kind of situation at the United Nations now. We continue to get people into the country. We have over 2,500 staff in country, you know, continuing to deliver assistance for the people of Myanmar. We continue to get visas for them, and we continue to get authorizations for them to move around the country. So I don't think that we're in the same situation as I understand from the briefing that Ethiopia finds itself in.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Lenka White, Mainichi newspaper. Given that the fighting is increasing on both sides, how is the National Unity Government viewed among the people on the ground in comparison to the junta government? And are you in contacts with the UN Special Envoy and the ASEAN Envoy and maybe asking them for some action? Thank you.
Yeah, of course, I personally meet with the Special Envoy on a weekly basis and with members of her team even more frequently than that. And the Special Envoy has made it clear that she is speaking with all stakeholders, including the National Unity Government. Now, in terms of how they're, I mean, I guess fair to say that I can repeat what I said earlier. You know, emotions in the country by people are running very, very high. There's a great deal of frustration on the part of people here. You know, we're not doing any opinion polling, so I wouldn't be able to give you any more detail on that. But there's a great deal of emotion and frustration amongst people here.
Let me take one last question from Abdelhamid Sayam.
Thank you, Mr. Kirkwood. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayan from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. And my question, sir, about the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. Do you see that the international community had failed them and left them to their destiny? Security Council did not do much to rescue this small community who had been subject to ethnic cleansing, as described by the former High Commissioner for Human Rights. And my question, can the Security Council do a little bit more to solve the issue? Thank you.
I mean, I don't think I can speak for the Security Council, but you know, in terms of here on the ground, we are providing humanitarian assistance to as many people as we can, including the Rohingya in Rakhine State. We continue to provide the assistance that we can. We continue to advocate for their freedom of movement and you know, other human rights. And we continue to work hard on creating the conditions for Rohingya to return to Rakhine.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Kirkwood, for your patience. A reminder to everyone that Andrew Kirkwood is the acting resident and humanitarian coordinator for the UN in Myanmar. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Please, colleagues, stay on because the briefings are not done. I now give the podium to Monica